And we begin, Chapter 2. Hasan could barely contain his exhilaration at the thought of being astride Alewa once more. She was named for the guiding wind of the highlands the conjugal used, like a sailor uses stars to traverse the wastes. Her gender had no bearing on her size, as it normally did with Dohar. She was nearly the rival of her sire Brahava, his father's horse, in size and strength, and she was an equal match in fierce stubbornness. Whereas Brahava's stubborn streak was born from the bravado of sheer brute, Alewa was more refined and intelligent. He refused commands at times because he didn't want to, while she considered her request and found it lacking. It was this intelligence that made her magnificent. True, she would sometimes refuse to follow the directed path, but Alewa would then choose the one that she insisted was better. Much to Hasan's surprise, her decisions were often better. This wonderful trait did have its drawbacks, however. Alewa was a prize among horses and was smart enough to know it. She was from a champion line and was the chosen mount of the Ka. In her view, it was demeaning to be cared for by the handlers like all the other horses. One of her standing should only be cared for by her master. This normally wasn't an issue, as Hasan truly loved her and had no problem unsaddling her and rubbing her shimmering golden coat down every day. But like the Grand Hall, the picket lines were a place that risked ambush by mothers and daughters. So he'd been avoiding it for at least the past week. Now that he was returning, Hasan could tell what must have transpired by the glares from those tending the horses around him, and those looks spoke volumes. All the handlers appeared busy, and rightfully so. There was a lot to do to prepare the camp for the road, but there was an exaggeration to their actions, as if they were purposely trying to look too busy to help him. They did, however, each spare a moment to glare accusingly after his passing, but none were willing to interact. He'd seen a moon like this before. In times like these, Hasan was always forced to speak with the herdmaster if he expected any help at all. Receive a scolding from was probably a better way to describe it. Hopefully the urgency of his mission would help to hasten the listing of all of Alewa's transgressions. Gorsha was at the head of the picket line, as always, barking out orders to his underlings. He was a cold, stern taskmaster by day and completely hilarious drunk come nightfall. Neither person truly banished under the other. Gorsha's portly stomach was an oddity among the hard-bodied Conchugal. Many joked the only reason he was herdmaster was so that one day he could breed a Dohar strong enough to carry his massive girth. It was all good-natured, and he often used his trait to some humorous advantage when telling the stories of the Grand Hall. But there was very little humor in the look he gave us on now, and the way he was explicitly rubbing his right arm bandaged in a sling only highlighted the direction this confrontation was going. "Your she-devil bit me," Gorsha exclaimed before Hasan was even close, flailing his bandaged arm around as best he was able. Hasan was admittedly shocked it had gotten so bad so quickly, but he suspected Alewa was feeling the same weather-induced mood as he was. Hasan found the whole thing a little funny. A man so familiar with horses should know by now to watch all extremities when they ventured near Hasan's she-devil. On the other hand, Hasan had also been on the receiving end of quite a few of Alewa's moods and knew how much damage those teeth could do. She was slightly gentler with her master, but even he walked away with a few bruised teeth impressions from time to time. She refused to stay at the picket lines with the other horses. Gorsha began his tirade, and if by some miracle we get her hooked in, she just bites through the rope and goes where she wants. "I'm sorry. I haven't been around to keep her in order," Hasan apologized. "But my father has bid me hurry. I will have to hear of her escapades when I return." The mention of the Ka Ra brought the entire issue to an end. While the tribe was fully capable of forgetting who his father was when it suited them, they knew how to act when reminded. "Where is she now?" "Right where she insists she's gonna be," Gorsha replied, defeat clear in his voice. He pointed out past the picket lines to a small copse of trees where the branches formed a sheltering dome. "Insists she's better than all of us and shouldn't have to befoul herself with the rain, that one does. No matter what we try, she ends up right back there." Alewa was under the protective boughs, staring fixedly in their direction. Even without the sun, her golden coat shimmered and her blonde mane gleamed in the gloom. She locked eyes with Hasan for one brief moment, then turned her back on him and headed for the far side of her shelter. "Why isn't she tied up at least?" Hasan asked, but thought better of it once the words were out. "Because she flat out told me she wasn't gonna be," Gorsha exclaimed, pointing accusingly at his injured arm. "The beast bit me as soon as I tried to touch her reins, and she kicked me in the rump right out of her little fortress. For good measure." It was all Hasan could do not to laugh. While he felt bad that he was largely to blame for Alewa's behavior, he could also fully picture her rolling the pudgy herdmaster out with that contemptuous look of disdain she did so well. "Can you get her saddle and gear ready?" Hassan inquired, feigning shame. "I sent someone to drop it off over by her as soon as we heard you were coming, but not one of us is going to help you harness her." Gorsha shook his head emphatically, as if the refusal was not enough. "Not one man among us is going near that demon until you do something to set her straight." That comment was enough to decimate Hassan's demeanor. The mere thought of anyone trying to set Alewa straight, even himself, left him chuckling all the way to said demon's self-proclaimed abode. And his laughter must have struck a nerve, because he could feel the cold stare of Gorsha on the back of his neck every step. By the time he reached Alewa's side, a small group had congregated around the herdmaster to watch what was about to unfold. The relationship between the Khan and his horse was quite an amusement among the tribe, especially for the caretakers, who found it satisfying to watch the comical exchanges. Perhaps in some way it assuaged a bit of the hurt from the injuries Alewa had dealt them. Hassan made sure to end his chuckling and wipe the smile off his face before approaching Alewa. If she assumed he was in any way amused by her mood, the whole thing would start poorly. Gently, he laid his left hand on her ribs and began to caress her silky coat. The rebuff was immediate. She spun her head away from him so fast, her hindquarters smacked Hassan and sent him sprawling on his. As frustrating as Alewa was, he couldn't help but smirk a little as he climbed back to his feet. "I'm sorry, Alewa," Hassan murmured contritely, "but we don't have time for this. Father wants us to hurry. We're going on a mission." He never knew if she understood his words or read the emotions in his voice, but her responses were always meaningful. She turned and stared at him quizzically, as if weighing the importance of the mission in contrast to her wounded pride. To Hassan's surprise, she snorted assent and walked up beside him. However, she was no longer looking at him. "Are you two finished?" Old Dern called from behind him. The timing of his arrival with Alewa's unnatural acquiescence seemed less than coincidental. She never let him off this easily before. What was it about the man that could elicit such a response in her? He was about to write it off as happenstance when Dern greeted her. "Beautiful Alewa, is he giving you a hard time?" She nickered welcomingly in response, then turned to an accusatory glare at Hassan. It was bizarre to see her respond this way to anyone, even old Dern. He was certainly a familiar writer at Hassan's side, but she never seemed to pay him any mind before now. But one thing was undeniable. If Dern was involved, then he was most certainly responsible for it. As he sprang into Hassan pondered what it could mean as he secured the straps and buckles into place. There was definitely something big behind all the old man's recent machinations, but how did it involve Alewa? As he sprang into his saddle, Hassan noticed Dern leaning from his gelding to whisper something in Alewa's ear. She nickered once more in response, this time as if she were laughing, then stood at immediate attention to await Hassan's command. "So you speak to horses now, old man?" Hassan asked, perhaps with a bit more bite than he'd intended. He knew it was a silly way to think about a horse, but it offended him the way both horse and man pretended, like their little whispered exchange never happened. With Alewa, Hassan supposed he should consider himself lucky their reunion went so smoothly and leave it at that. But Dern was beginning to push the line. The old man had been pulling his strings all morning, and Hassan had waited long enough for answers. "I speak the language of life, Hassan." And thus with all living things. Dern said it with such an air of indifference that Hassan was left speechless. Besides, somebody had to talk to the poor thing. She was lonely, and there were things she had to know. A Qad does not enter his first Dahara as a man on his own 2 feet, and a horse like this would never be satisfied if she was not prepared to present her master properly. There was little Hassan could find to argue. Alewa wasn't human, but she was no common horse either. If she were to make some misstep, or blemish his entrance at such a grand event, she wouldn't take it lightly. But the explanation only made his aggravation worse. Here he was, desperately in need of answers, and his horse knew more about it than he did. "It's time to start answering questions," Hassan demanded, with a bit less venom than last time. "There will always be questions. But the first is how we will ever catch up to your father." Dern dismissed him with a wink and a roguish grin. Then the mount beneath him launched into a gallop from some unspoken command. At that moment, all of Hassan's troubles evaporated. The need to overtake Dern was euphoric. After 3 months of forced idleness, the urge to ride was finally unleashed. Alewa felt it too. As Dern shrank into the distance, she quivered with anticipation. That same shiver continued up through Hassan's body in a wave and left him momentarily breathless. "Na-ha-sa," his mind screamed. Then he set his heels and they were off like a bolt of golden lightning. Dern's horse was just as much a paradox as its rider. It was almost too small to be referred to as a Dahar, but despite its age and diminutive exterior, it was agile and swift. And as the dapple grew smaller on the horizon, Alewa unleashed her full speed to catch up. Hasan nearly screamed with elation, as the coursing beast beneath him seemed to take flight. Ilewa's thunderous hooves struck the mud pathways with concussive blows, but the wind was whistling past his ears so fast he couldn't hear it. But he could feel it. Each thrumming beat rolled through him like the bass of a massive drum. It became his pulse. It mirrored the time of each breath. The diminishing remnants of the hastily disassembled camp flew by in a blur of brief glimpses, but he paid it no heed. He was free. They overtook Dern just outside the camp, and both mounts slowed slightly to keep pace, but at this speed talking was still out of the question. They rode across a small valley, if it could even be called that. It was more like a large hole someone punched into the outer rim. Surrounded by the cliffs of the plateau with one narrow, winding pass leading up and out, it was there they would meet up with Hasan's father. They arrived at a dead run, and the Ka-Ra and his arms-master both drew weapons in response to their sudden approach. Hasan could sense the tension in the air as he rode up. These were two men who expected trouble. As he reined in, Dern right behind him, his father looked him up and down, assessing his son. "I see you took my advice and changed," Hasan smiled somewhat mockingly, but there was a hint of bemused pride. "Yes, Ka-Ra." It was the usual way Hasan would address him. It wasn't the usual way Hasan would address him, but he hoped this newfound show of respect would add to his father's bewilderment. The matter of how people perceived him might have started with Dern's manipulation, but the shock on his father's face when Hasan requested to come distressed him. Did his father think less of him as well? It wasn't that he was ever disrespectful. He was always formal when situations dictated it so, but for the most part he acted like a regular boy in the camp. He gave barely a thought to what his position meant or required. But something had been started, and Hasan was so far pleased with the results. So when he returned to his tent to change, he made sure he looked the part of Ka. In the place of the tattered raiment he so frequently donned over the last few months, Hasan wore a tan riding suit of fine oiled leathers. It was one of the few things left that he'd been able to keep dry. Small leather plates overlapped down his arms and legs like umber-painted scales. They were flexible and allowed him to move unhindered, but they were designed to give protection in a fight. His hair was slicked and tightly braided down the back, much neater than his earlier attempt. The slim, curved blade of his sword hung at his left side with a pair of fierce-looking hunting knives to balance it on his right. Hasan hoped his appearance would say more that he was Ka, but that he also heeded his father's warning and came prepared for a fight. "Almost looks dangerous, don't he?" Cho'Gath mocked. His attempt at a grin was made frightful by the fierce, ragged scar that split his mouth. The deep, throaty chuckle that accompanied it was even more discomfiting. "You've known my sword, Cho'Gath," Hasan parried back, "so don't pretend I'm some mewling child who doesn't know which end is a blade." He was rather beginning to enjoy this new Hasan. He'd spent years matching wit and word with old Dern, and it was about time he saw it had any value outside of that purview. He was determined to keep everyone off guard about his change, so he could see how they responded. Apparently it was working. Cho'Gath now gave him the same bemused look his father had, and the great Ka-Ra found the exchange vastly amusing. He bellowed with laughter and slapped his arms-master on the shoulder in jest. "Shall we discover who knows whose sword best, little Ka?" "We can find out right now." There was no anger in Cho'Gath's words. It was nothing more than a challenge. The look on his face was something Hasan knew all too well. Cho'Gath was craving a fight, and Hasan had given him a motive. "There's no time for that right now," Hasan interrupted. I hope to see this spy check out the city and be back with the tribe before nightfall. We only have a few hours." With that, he turned his massive chestnut charger into the narrow pass and began the long climb. Cho'Gath was right behind him. Hasan turned to Dern. "So you ran away to avoid talking to me, and now you get to delay it with even longer while we climb? Are you messing with me, old man?" "Nonsense," Dern chided. "I didn't run away to avoid your questions. I made you run so you might clear your mind. A clear mind is much more conducive to receiving answers. You wanted to run. Needed to run. So we ran. Now you won't feel so restless when you're forced to ride next to an old man and listen for a while." He didn't wait for a response. He nudged his horse forward into the narrow defile of the pass. "Marvelous performance, by the way. We might just make a Ka out of you yet." His words echoed back as he and the grey dapple vanished behind the first turn in the path. Hasan could only smile as he directed Ilewa forward. He didn't need their approval to feel pride in his actions so far, but it was discouraging to know he wasn't alone in enjoying the outcome. However, Dern's satisfaction could only mean one thing. Hasan was doing exactly what the old man wanted him to do. This certainly gnawed at him as he climbed, but the path was so narrow they were forced to ride single file, preventing him from voicing his complaints. In the end, none of it mattered. Soon he would be free of that wretched valley. If he had his wish, it would be forever, but the months of freedom ahead were enough for now. The pass was formed from long years of water flowing from the plateau to the valley behind him. A long-forgotten river cut deep into the surrounding cliffs, winding back and forth through its endless trek to the lowest possible point. Perhaps it was a waterfall at one time, until the river ran dry. In its place was a boulder-strewn pathway that zigzagged back and forth to the top. The massive hooves of the Dahar were adept at finding footholds among the rubble, and they made their way quickly. Hassan brooded at first, but as they neared the end he grew anxious. A faint mist appeared around them as they passed into the thick blankets of clouds that hung endlessly over the valley. It set Hassan's heart beating faster. Soon he would feel the sun on his face. Even Alewa seemed to sense it. She was attempting to climb faster, but faced the slow-moving rear of Durn's horse. She grunted with annoyance, and for a second Hassan thought she might take a bite out of the offending rump. He couldn't blame her. The weight was killing him too, and then, suddenly, they were through. The sun blazed gloriously in the sky, a burning ball of amber amidst a field of unblemished cerulean. Its warming rays fell caressingly against Hassan's skin and shimmered from his sandy hair, but he was no longer accustomed to the brilliance and was forced to shield his eyes. When he finally adjusted, he was greeted with sights too long denied him. Alewa's golden coat sparkled in the sunlight like a desert mirage, and the land before him stretched out for miles of stone and sand bedecked in a multitude of earthen hues. It was only the first tier of the ascending steps, but at last he'd returned to the highlands. Behind him, the valley had vanished beneath the dense cloud bank. The sheer cliff face they climbed contained the mist like a bowl holding porridge. The swirling fog appeared intent on escape, like some unseen force was struggling to push it up and over the plateau's edge, but couldn't muster the strength. On the far side of the valley, a trough was eroded into the cliffs, and it was through this opening the clouds flowed from an infinite expanse of billowing white. A divide of cloud and cliff went on for miles in either direction, marking the boundaries of the highlands and the lowland shore, and just past the shore, beneath the rolling fields of white, was the Illyrian Sea. Cho'Gha and his father were busy conversing, so Hassan felt this was a perfect time to get some more information out of old Durn. As if the thought were a summons, the old man rode up beside him. Before Hassan could even open his mouth to voice his questions, Durn began to speak. "What do you see, Hassan?" "I see the highlands and home," Hassan replied matter-of-factly. "I see the sun for the first time in months, and I see the outer rim just waiting for Alewa and me to ride across its rugged expanse." "Humph," Durn grumbled. "You look with only your eyes, and you see with too young of a heart." "Well, what do you expect me to see?" Hassan exclaimed. "This is getting ridiculous. You speak with riddles and you answer no questions. Since it's obvious you'll have your way no matter what, why not tell me what I need to see and be done, and what I need to see and do and be done with it already?" "I cannot simply tell you what it is you must see," Durn assumed, one of the many preaching personas. His voice was level and direct, but with a hint of condescension. It seemed in these moments that Durn could cast off all guise of conjugal and appear more like the peculiar philosophers from the centers of learning and science far to the south. "If I pointed out for you, I would be defeating the point. For you to truly understand everything, you must learn to see it with your own eyes. Now look again. Only this time look closely. Tell me what is wrong." Hassan did as he was told, more out of a desire to be done with the entire business than any remaining curiosity. He was growing frustrated with the whole business. Every time he thought he was about to get answers, Durn would play his mind games and leave him with more questions than before. This whole looking exercise was likely just another delaying tactic in the old man's arsenal of mental tricks, but the only way through it was to play along. So he looked with resolve. Looked for what is wrong. So Hassan did. Obviously something had changed for the worse. If it had to be something different, something had a place. He noted the clouds still low in the valley and considered them an option. Normally this time of year, the clouds would have pushed up past the first of the plateaus and dispersed across the outer rim of the highlands, bringing the meager spring rains. But that hadn't happened for the past few years. It was for that very reason his tribe was forced to winter in a horrifically saturated valley. Only the rare great storms of the sea in summer seemed able to breach the fortress of the cliffs and bring the gift of rain, and those were growing fewer as well. Could this be what Durn wanted him to see? But he'd seen this all before. There had to be something else. Hassan gazed at his homeland with cold reason this time, absorbing every detail and contrasting it to memories past. The land looked normal to his eyes at first, but small, almost indiscernible details began to show. The talon bushes, one of the hardiest species of the wastes, looked wan. Of course, their leaves were always a sickly mustard color, but the bushes appeared sparsely grown. There weren't even buds for new spring growth, and those appeared during the harsh months of winter. He knew it couldn't be the drought alone. Talon bushes grew in the harshest, driest places. They could go years without rain, so what was causing their decline? One discovery led to others. Not only were the talon bushes failing, but most of the scarce Highlands plant life was either withering or completely absent from the scenery altogether. While many of the spring flowers that once flourished on the outer rim had vanished since the longer, drier winters took hold, now the casualties were those much less likely to fail due to a mere drought. Sandkey creeper, spike and windlasher grasses, even the stone-like rock polyps were dead or dying. Strangely, the lifeless features, those that didn't require water for sustenance, seemed faded as well. The stone outcroppings and boulders that adorned the vast flats weren't as vibrant. Their layers of hues from red to brown to gold appeared pale and didn't shimmer in the sun quite as brilliantly. It was still beautiful to hold. It was still his home. But though the signs were vague unless you really looked, the evidence was clear. The Highlands was dying. I can tell by the look on your face you now see it, Dern interrupted. Do you understand now why you had to realize it for yourself? Because I was so excited about being back, I never would have believed it. He hated it when Dern was right, but he had to admit his euphoria at being in the sun once more had clouded his judgment. So why is it happening? The words just left his lips when his father and Cho'Gath rode up. Our spy is held several miles from here. We're still not sure what's going on, so be careful and stay to the rear. His father eyed them both for a brief moment, then turned and rode along the valley's rim to the south with his arms-master in tow. Are you kidding me? Hassan exclaimed, nearly yelling. Every single time I think I'm about to get some answers, we're interrupted and sent scurrying along to wait for the next appropriate time to talk. This is getting ridiculous. Hassan's rage was building, and the frustration was feeding it more. He couldn't blame Dern for this most recent delay, but it seemed like some sick conspiracy to drive him to madness. That anger was brought to an abrupt halt by Dern's reaction. The old man exploded into a gravelly cackle at Hassan's outburst. His body shook so hard from the laughter he nearly fell from his horse. Even the Ka-Ra and Cho'Gath turned to look at the spectacle. Hassan, my child, Dern began, as he gulped for air, his mirth finally subsiding. We're out in the open now. We ride at a steady pace, and there are no passes to force us to ride single file. What makes you think we cannot continue this talk as we travel? He grinned encouragingly, as if he expected Hassan to find the humor in it as well. This is what you've done to me, old man, Hassan pronounced accusingly. Your meddling has turned me into a raving madman. My mind is filled with so many unanswered questions I can't think straight. Then let's get answering some of those questions, Dern replied in a mockingly consoling tone. He nudged his mount forward, then motioned Hassan to ride beside him. It took a moment for Hassan to regain his composure. Maintaining his new Ka-like calm was proving more difficult than he anticipated, at least with how much his patience was currently being tested. But there was something important in what the old man had to teach, and even if he was to be driven mad in the process, he was determined to get to the bottom of it. Alewa seemed to sense his mood, and without command briskly started forward the moment he retained a better state of calm. You asked what is causing it. For me to answer that, you must know a little history. Don't worry. It will begin to answer the questions from earlier this morning. He waited a moment to see if Hassan would interact, and then slipped into the guise of a bard. Long before the first Khan Cho'Gath, when gods walked the earth, there were two divine lovers. There were two divine lovers. There we go. Hatsune, the storm goddess, and Volgoth, the stone lord. Together they ruled over an immense swath of the coast and far into the inner continent. Like most gods of their day, they were passionate in their lovemaking, bending the elements to their carnal desires. Hatsune, fueled by the turbulent waters of her ocean domain, wove great tempests from the Illyrian Sea, and rode their winds endless to crush the vastness of her consort's earthen realm. Volgoth in turn thrust the bedrock of the land skyward to meet the tempestuous mistress. The impassioned merging of their elements and the frequency with which they partook of these pleasures resulted in a realm that was the jewel of all Illyria. Dern stopped to chuckle softly for a moment. The tiered plateaus of the highlands were forged from Volgoth's passions. Hatsune's lust shed her life-giving waters across his towering cliffs and stony vestiges. Their bonding provided a lush world of beauty for their followers. Waterfalls fell from tier to tier in majestic columns, casting a mist across the land alight with rainbows. What we call the Bitter Waste was one of the two great inland seas bordered with verdant meadows of wildflowers. Those drab-crusted stone polyps are defended from jewel-like corals of the Illyrian Sea. Hatsune gifted them to her lover, transformed so they might live outside of the ocean's protective waters. They flourished in the bountiful highlands, their shimmering branches sprouting from rock columns to form forests of coral trees rife with magnificent splendor of color and life. The highlands you love so well, I'm afraid, is but a pale shadow of its former glory. Hassan was mesmerized. He'd heard endless stories from Dern on how different the world was in the age of gods, but they always seemed like some mythical place far from the world he existed. This was the first time he heard of his homeland, and something about that made it seem more real somehow. He'd seen the great coral forests. They were mostly swaths of stone piles and crumbled pillars now, but now and then he came across a formation that had stood the onslaught of time. There was no denying their resemblance to trees, and they even maintained a faint remnant of their multitude of colors. For the first time in his life, Hassan had some measure of evidence to prove the fantastical claims Dern was always spouting. It made him sad to think the land he thought of as this majestic home was merely a withered husk of its true potential. In a way, he mused it was rather fitting that the Contra Gaul were tied to it, for they too were less than what they truly could be. But none of it seemed to matter. Hatsune and Volgoth were long gone from this world, their life-bringing magic extinguished from existence. And if that was the reason for the decline of the Highlands, then what could they possibly do about it? How do you know all of this? And why have I never heard of it before? Hassan asked. They were probably the wrong questions as far as Dern was concerned, but it seemed the only logical starting point in sorting out what he just learned. He couldn't understand how, if his people were so tied to the land, why they never spoke about what it used to be. Were they ashamed of it? Did they mourn its loss? Hassan hadn't completely decided how he felt about it. It sounded beautiful, but all that rain sounded horrific. I am an old man, Hassan. Old men learn many things throughout their lives and read many books. As for your second question, most of the Contra Gaul don't know. It isn't a secret exactly, it just isn't discussed often anymore. But why? Hassan asked intently. His questions were finally being answered freely, which meant he had somehow traversed Dern's evasions and achieved a new level of discussion. He needed to make sure he asked everything that came to mind so that he wasn't left with some nagging uncertainty. Perhaps because they think it is disrespectful to refer to the land they love as what it once was. Maybe it is because they are too sad. Perhaps the reason is different for everybody. Your father knows. He was told as Ka when he first became a man as well. It is part of a Ka-Ra's duty to know these truths. Dern was fully engaged, and once he answered, he anxiously awaited the next question. So that story is about the greatness lost, isn't it? Hassan obliged him. You remember Dern said questions from the morning would be answered, and this one seemed most likely. Once again, though, he came back to the same barrier. The gods were dead. The greatness was lost forever. In part, yes. But there were many other works of greatness. This one just falls closer to home for its audience. There appeared to be no leading or manipulation in Dern's words as he continued to instruct his pupil. So if the gods are dead, how are we supposed to find their greatness? How will we stop the land from dying? The queries flew from Hassan's lips as he raced to extract as much knowledge as possible before the fountain ran dry. He feared any second one of his questions would cross some unseen line and he would be back to chasing answers. Those questions require a lot more time to answer than I think we have. Dern's words caused Hassan's back to stiffen immediately. He did it. He crossed that line. However, Dern continued, perhaps sensing his student's panic, I will do what I can to explain as much as possible in the time that remains. Hassan breathed a sigh of relief at that and was granted an improving grin from his tutor. I told you of the story of the Highlands to show you how over time, as magic recedes, things change. But the gods' absence has nothing to do with the current decline. The gods have been gone for a millennium now, and the land the Highlands became after that was the balance restored by the great spirit of our world. It wasn't paradise anymore, but things survived, life endured. What is happening now is something altogether different. What is its cause? I haven't yet discovered, but as a future Ka-Ra, it is your duty to know what challenges we face. So my father knows about this new threat? Hassan was stunned by the thought that his father would know of this and not do anything about it. He does, but he does what he must. He leads our people to survive, which is all he believes he can do. Once again, Dern's words answered details of questions Hassan hadn't even voiced. It was like he could predict what Hassan wanted and worded his questions to appease all his curiosities, even those unasked. That's why he's so anxious to get to the Dahara, isn't it? It will be the first one since things started getting bad. Dern only nodded in response to Hassan's question. He looked on his pupil with approval, encouraging him to ask yet another. Is there anything that can be done to stop it? Without knowing the cause, we are unlikely to find a cure. But if anyone can do it, I believe it's you. It is in your bloodline. Dern said it with such certainty Hassan felt a physical jolt from the shock of it. Why me? Hassan exclaimed, his bewilderment evident. Why not my father? He's the Ka-Ra, after all. He shares your birthright, this is true, but he is not the man I believe you can become. He is bound to the Highlands, perhaps more than any of us. He loves it too much to ever truly notice the magic that is missing. He wasn't even able to notice the decline as you did. His concern is for the weather and how it will affect his people, and so he doesn't understand how to combat it. He's not capable or willing to ask the questions he needs to find a way. Dern bowed his head slightly in deference to show he meant no respect against Hassan's father. You, however, have a keen mind, a mind I have had my hand in shaping. You have great potential, and for the sake of your people, I want to see you reach it. Hassan was taken aback, but he knew that Dern said was true. He and his father were worlds apart intellectually, while Hassan was by far not a simpleton. He would never be capable of managing the level of verbal jousting that Hassan and Dern delighted in. And the Kahra was deeply traditional. He didn't welcome change kindly, but they both had the same birthright. They were both the most direct descendants of the bloodline of the great Ayun Ka, the first seeker. That inheritance came with the duty of being Kahra. It was growing more apparent there was something else that came with it as well. Whatever it was, wouldn't his father be capable of doing it too? There was only one way to find out. So this morning you mentioned the Ayun Ka, my ancestor. Why was he the first seeker? Why are those descended from him automatically seekers as well? This was it, Hassan thought as he said it. He was finally going to discover what this whole thing was all about. Their conversation that morning had centered on the first seeker, and he had been filled with questions ever since. The excitement of learning the truth at last had him nearly standing in his stirrups. Those are marvelous questions, and they lead us right to where this needs to go. But as you can see, our time has drawn to an end, Dern finished in an apologetic voice as he gestured to what lay ahead. There were figures not far off in the distance, 2 men and 2 large horses. The size of the mounts made it certain they were members of the tribe. The crumpled heap lying on the ground nearby must be the spy the guards apprehended. The 2 who were standing waved in recognition and in response. Hassan's father brought his horse to a run to go and meet them. Hassan felt a great deal of disappointment in being interrupted before that grand revelation. But he learned a lot in such a short period and could use some time to mull it over. Besides, the spy business was intriguing. Who would want to spy on the Concho Gaul? He was about to find out. That promised to be just as interesting as Dern at the moment. So he urged Alewa into a run to catch up. As Hassan rode up to join them, he found everybody still fully engaged with the guards as they gave their salutes of respect to the Kahra. Hassan's eyes went immediately to the prisoner. The man looked haggard. He slumped forlornly on the ground as if all hope was lost. By his clothes he appeared to be a dock worker from the port city, apparently not a prosperous one, though. His long, black, matted hair was disheveled and unwashed, and he trembled at what looked at first like fear. But his eyes showed not a hint of it. His head might have been downcast, but those cold, steely eyes scanned the new arrivals methodically. Hassan watched a meticulous inspection take place, paying close attention to the long seconds the strangers spent on their weapons. He could have been terrified they would use one upon him, but that wasn't what Hassan saw. This man didn't fear for his life. He measured the threat of his new opponents. Hassan saw that look in Chugah's eyes many a time, and it wasn't the look of a simple dock worker. He learned a lot from Dern over the years, and one important fact was people weren't always what they seemed. Because of this enlightenment, he was able to see the truth. Hassan's attention didn't go unnoticed, however, and as those dark, dead eyes locked onto his, he felt a chill go up his spine. This man was dangerous. Of that fact he was certain. He stared back as long as he could, but the malice in those eyes was almost too much to bear. He finally gave in and turned back to the conversation taking place with his father. "Just some bum paid to see where we were," one of the guards said as he finished his report. Before the Kahra could even respond, a disturbance drew their attention to the prisoner. He was on his feet and somehow managed to slip the ropes from his wrists and ankles. He didn't even look in their direction as he sprinted away. Hassan didn't give the notion a second thought. Alewa didn't either, because before he even gave the command, she broke loose into a gallop in pursuit. The others were too stunned by the turn of events to respond, so Hassan rode alone. The stranger was fast, but Alewa was faster. They rode up on him with incredible speed, and just as Alewa was about to trample the escapee into the ground, she reared up and carried all of the momentum down into the earth with a pummeling stomp of her massive hooves. The force of the strikes sent the stranger tumbling forward to his knees. But he wasn't defeated. "You shouldn't have done that, boy." His voice was hard and gravelly, and it seethed with hatred. As the stranger leaped stealthily to his feet, his hand disappeared within the confines of his tunic. He started to withdraw something that gleamed metallic in the sun, but it was gone before it was fully revealed, tucked back into his hiding place. His demeanor changed almost as fast as he made that item disappear. The lethal foe seemed to melt back into the disheveled, trembling peasant he first appeared to be. He kept his eyes down, but Hassan could still see them enough to know the stranger had somehow managed to alter those as well. The cold hardness was gone. In its place was the terrified look of a poor soul awaiting certain death. Hassan was startled by the sudden transformation, but he'd seen something like it before. He had to admit this man might even rival Dern for his mastery of assuming new personas. It seemed an odd time to do so, though, right before killing someone, but then he heard the percussive hoofbeats of the others as they approached at a dead run, and he understood. 4 spear points came to abrupt halt, inches from piercing the stranger's heart. Hassan, who was paying close attention to him at the time, noticed he didn't flinch at all from it. He didn't even appear to blink as the Dahar brought a certain death down upon him. But the second the spear stopped, he dropped into a cowering ball and whimpered. "He's got weapons," Hassan declared without looking away. "In his shirt." The two guards ripped open the prisoner's tunic. Beneath was an array of sworded blades strapped tightly across his torso with leather belts. It was a deadly-looking collection, not your ordinary tools of the docks. "'Tis a dangerous world we live in, me lords," the stranger immediately began to stammer. "I must be protected myself." His new voice was nothing like before. The dopey brogue with which he now spoke made him sound like an imbecile. And if Hassan hadn't witnessed what he lay beneath firsthand, he probably would have fallen for it. The act was superb, but Hassan saw it for what it was, an act. He silently thanked Dern for his tutelage. Without having witnessed such changes before, he would never have been able to identify it now. Perhaps the old man wasn't as crazy as he thought. "Who sent you?" Hassan asked in a cold and authoritative tone. He jumped down from Merhaba and walked up to stare straight into the prisoner's eyes. The spy hung limp now in the two guards' clutches, visibly reluctant to return that gaze, but Hassan was certain if it weren't necessary to maintain his clever facade, those cold, dead eyes would be staring daggers right back at his father. "Some merchants who stopped me in the street and offered a little coin to run up and see if you were still camped nearby. That's all. I just needed some coin." The man stuttered and spat as he talked, and sounded as if he was struggling to get his next word formed. And the last part came out in a squeal like he was ashamed of his own reasoning. Brilliantly played, Hassan thought to himself. He kept staring straight into his eyes, hoping that the contact would force him to break character for even a second. He knew the whole thing was a ruse, but he couldn't think of how to present that fact to his father. It was apparent that Kara didn't sense the same danger in the spy as he did. But would he believe Hassan? Even if he told him? This was the first time he'd accompanied his father like this, and was only beginning to convince him he was a worthy Ka. A warning now would probably sound cowardly and undo all the work he'd accomplished. He looked around in search of solace from Dern, and found him mounted right beside him. Hassan gave him a questioning look and received a slow nod in response, so the old man had seen it too. Perhaps that could be used to his advantage in convincing his father. "Who were these merchants?" his father continued. The interrogation, the harshness and threat in his tone were as fake as the spy's fear. If his father were truly serious, his hand would have been on his hilt, and Cho'Gah would have the man up by his ankles if he thought there was any danger present for him. How could they miss it? "Just some men from ships, me lords. They sailed in the other day," the spy replied hastily. He was very eager to please. "What ships?" "Big ships, that's all I know." The prisoner buried his face in his shoulder, hiding from the death blow, certain to fall because of his lack of information. It was pathetic, Hassan thought. He had to put a stop to it. He wanted to scream liar, but Dern taught him cunning was usually a better work. "You're a dock worker, aren't you? Or at least you look the part. How is it you don't know ships?" Everyone turned as Hassan's voice interjected, clearly startled. Even Dern looked a little surprised by the outburst, but his eyes said he approved. For just a brief moment that steely death returned to the prisoner's eyes, but it was gone again in a flash. Unfortunately, both his father and Cho'Gah had turned to look at him as well and missed the whole thing. He doubted the man would be as lax again. Without acknowledging the looks, Hassan continued, "Answer me." The moment of shock vanished as they turned as one back to the spy, but the stranger was quick-minded and didn't answer immediately. "I work nowhere, me lord, and I wear what I can or can afford. A boat is just a boat to me." The answer was pathetic and brilliant all at the same time. "Are the ships still in the city?" the Kara asked, assuming control over the questioning once more. "I couldn't tell you," the spy replied. "I've been wandering this blasted desert since morning looking for your camp. Had you not found me, I don't think I would have survived much longer. They might still be there, or they might not be. Either way, I doubt they'll give me some of my coins." "This man is useless," Cho'Gah exclaimed abruptly. "We could get more out of asking the rocks. You should leave him here and get to the city." "What do you think, Hassan?" his father asked. The question caught him off guard at first. Was his father actually asking for his counsel? If so, then he had surely made great strides with him today, but he still hadn't managed to unmask the stranger for what he truly was. How could he do that and still maintain this level of respect? There was no obvious way to do both, so he did what he thought was right. "I don't trust him. He's a spy, that's true, but he's just somebody's lackey. Besides, if he's not to be trusted, what would you have me do with him?" There was more to his father's question than a request for opinions. He could sense the judgment in the words. Hassan considered it for a moment. He knew the stranger was dangerous, and he was positive he wasn't telling them everything. Then there were his eyes. Those dark, soulless portals reflected not just the atrocities he meant to commit, but the horrors he'd already imposed upon the world. Hassan looked at the quivering figure and remembered the cold, menacing gaze they shared and the threats implicit in it. There was only one way to assure the danger was removed. "Kill him," Hassan replied coldly. He was startled by the ease with which he pronounced the death sentence. He'd never taken a life before, and now was commanding one be ended, but he'd never been this unsettled by anyone. Deep down he knew if they let him walk away, they would regret it. If his true duty was to the safety and survival of his people, then this was the only logical decision. Hassan anticipated a sudden reaction, was fully prepared to defend his cruel-sounding answer, but initially there was nothing but silence. Cho'Gahan, his father, looked stunned. It seemed logical his father felt that way. How many fathers expect to see the day when their sons order somebody's death in front of them? But Cho'Gahan was made of harder stuff than his father. Another death in defense of the tribe was nothing to him. So it seemed odd to Hassan that the Armsmaster didn't agree with him immediately. He looked to Dern for support. There he found no opinion either way. The old man gazed at him cautiously. It wasn't a look of reproach. Instead it seemed like he was certain. Yes, I'm sure he does. By the end of book 1, actually. He looked to Dern for support. There he found no opinion either way. The old man gazed at him cautiously. It wasn't a look of reproach. Instead, it seemed he was searching for something in Hassan's eyes, measuring his pupil's heart before giving judgment. He's dangerous, Hassan said into the hushed quiet. Just look at his weapons. He pointed at the pile of cruel blades the guards had collected. Those are not the weapons of a simpleton. I understand your concern, Hassan replied sternly, but I won't kill a man without proof it was required. You show me weapons and I ask you, are we just as deserving of death then? We are armed quite heavily as well. You say he's dangerous, but he is unarmed and outnumbered. I understand you are trying to look strong for me today, but the Conchogal do not murder people without good cause. That last part cut deep for Hassan. He didn't care whether his father saw him as strong right now. All he cared about was ending the danger the stranger posed. He knew he risked any respect he'd gained, but he believed the safety of his tribe was more important than that. It angered him that his father could think so little of him. It was nearly an accusation that Hassan was willing to commit murder to feed his own pride. I am thinking of the Conchogal, father, Hassan replied defensively. If we let him go, we risk their safety. The camp was already packed and is on the move. Our people are probably halfway to the first rung of the ladders by now. Any danger he may have posed to them has passed. There was a finality to it that brooked no further debate. The Ka-Ra had decided. He turned his back on his son then and began to give commands to the 2 guards. You 2 will come to the city with us. Let this man go, but not until we are leaving. Hassan nearly screamed at his father, not because of any insult, but because of the stupid mistake he just made. They were standing right next to a spy who was sent to find their location, and the great all-knowing Ka-Ra just told him where they were and where they were going. He turned to Dern with pleading eyes, praying the old man could help to fix this. Might I suggest something that could allay all parties' concerns? Dern called out to Hassan's father. Hassan turned and glared at the old man with annoyance, then gave in and asked, What is it? Just a second. What is it? Dern dropped down from his horse and scurried over to the spy's confiscated arsenal. There is no evidence of this man's immediate threat. That is obvious. He deductively argued as he wrapped the weapons up in the stranger's cloak. As he stood, he turned back to Hassan's father. But there is evidence he willingly spied for profit. Should there not be some punishment for this transgression? And what would you suggest as punishment? Hassan asked interestedly. I am glad you asked, Dern replied in that overtly grateful tone. He turned to look straight at the stranger as he walked towards the cliff's edge. He talked the whole way there. You see, I think if he is guilty of doing something wrong for profit, then he should be deprived of some wealth and repentance. Since it appears he only truly holds one thing of value, the choice is obvious. He never once took his eyes from the man's face, even as he halted precipitously at the sheer edge of the drop. You have committed an offense to the Conchogal, Dern pronounced to the prisoner. For this crime I shall deprive you of your weapons. This way you pose less of a threat. With that he opened his arms and let the bundle of knives fall through the clouds into the valley floor below. Hassan felt a hint of relief at this permanent disarming. He only hoped the weapons fell into a quagmire and sank, but seeing the owner's reaction was satisfying enough. It was only a slight variation, but visible to somebody as attentive as he'd become. For just a second, as the weapons dropped, the spy's artful trembling became an uncontrolled quiver of rage. Hassan smiled satisfactorily. Furthermore, Dern continued as he returned to the group, to make sure you don't run back to your employer as soon as we're finished with you. He paused and turned to the Ka-Ra for permission. Hassan nodded amusedly. Dern turned to the guards. Strip him, he ordered. What? Both guards blurted at once. Why? Think about it, Dern explained in a chastising tone. Where will a naked man go first? To his boss to stand there naked and admit he failed, or home to grab a new pair of trousers? Hassan and Cho'Gahan both burst out laughing. Very good, old man, Hassan commended. You too, do as he says. We leave shortly. Then he and his Armsmaster huddled together to discuss matters. Hassan and Dern approached the strange scene together. The guards were extricating the prisoner from his rags and looking none too happy about it. With the threat of the Kabra removed, the stranger's eyes had come alive with malice again. There was no doubting now how Hassan felt about him, and after Dern's performance there was no question what his opinions were. He felt no need to hide it anymore. Hassan looked at the hard flesh and deftly sculpted muscles revealed by the spy's nudity. It only confirmed his suspicions. That was the physique of a fighter. The numerous scars that covered him were attested to how many people shared Hassan's opinion of him. He might not be able to put an end to him, Hassan conceded that for now, but the scorpion had at least been removed of his stinger. He just needed to find out who he truly was now. "What is your name?" Try as Hassan might, he couldn't wipe the look of victory from his face. He knew if they were to meet in different circumstances, the outcome would be quite different. But for now, he'd won this match. "They call me Avar," the man responded coarsely. The words were calm, but those eyes, once locked, spoke only violence. "It is a simple name, but someday people will learn to give it respect." To the ignorant, the statement sounded quite clearly like some helpless peasant aspiring to make something of himself, but Hassan listened for the pauses, remembered which words gained the most emphasis. He knew it for the threat it was. It was a promise that they would meet again, and Hassan felt certain Avar would keep it. When his father rode up, they all mounted and left the naked stranger alone to the harsh elements of the highlands. Avar stood and watched them depart. "I didn't know what to think initially, but I agree with your assessment now," Dern muttered to Hassan from his place at his side. "That man is dangerous. It would have been better off throwing him over the cliff with his weapons." Hassan smiled. He knew he was right after witnessing the lethal intent in Avar's eyes when he rode him down. This just confirmed it. "You shouldn't doubt me," Hassan replied. "You taught me well." Dern chuckled at that for a moment. "You planned this whole day out, didn't you? I mean, not the spy or my father or anything like that, but you purposely strung me along so that by the time you finally started to answer questions, I would be begging for you to give them to me." Hassan didn't know why he was asking. He already knew the answer. Perhaps he simply wanted Dern to know that he knew. "Interesting theory." Dern seemed to contemplate it for a moment. "I always say the best student is an eager student." It was non-committal, but Hassan was able to read the admission in it. "Well, I'm eager, so start talking." "There is much to learn, and we have time. For now we have other mysteries to uncover. If someone like Avar is working for these people on the ships, we might have bigger problems than we thought." Dern looked his pupil over approvingly, then heeled his mount into a run. That realization hadn't come to Hassan yet. Hearing it brought a chill to his heart. Avar wasn't alone. He'd been hired by someone else. What kind of people would seek that villain's service? Everywhere he went today, he learned about a new danger to his people. It seemed. Something had to be done. But what? He couldn't say. "Let's go, Alewa. If there's going to be any fighting, I want us to be there to help." She whinnied excitedly and bolted after the others, leaving a trail of dust in her wake.